Hi, I'm Sarala. I was a past vice captain of the Cambridge debate team, and I'll be doing a motion debrief for the motion in states at risk of democratic backsliding, where anti-democratic politicians have won through legitimate elections. This House believes that violent resistance to the transfer of power is justified. So, a few things in terms of setup. First, in terms of what a legitimate election is, it is a free and to a certain extent fair election, but I think it's important to note that you can still have things like disinformation and polarization, and the political landscape doesn't have to be like perfectly free and fair in this sort of scenario. Second, in terms of transfer of power, so this motion is taking place, this violent resistance is ideally taking place at the point in which this leader has not yet taken office in an official capacity, but much rather you just know that he has like won the election and he is going to take power in the near future. So for proposition, I think especially it's important to establish that this elected leader does show very clear signs of dismantling democratic institutions and like dismantling democracy. It's not like a hunch or like you feel like, oh, he's going to act undemocratically. So this looks like him doing things like campaigning by delegitimizing like core democratic institutions like media, saying that like judges and courts are very biased and they don't function properly, things like that. And like maybe he has vowed to concentrate power in the executive branch. That may have been one of his main electoral promises. So you have a lot of signs that he is going to act very undemocratically once he takes power in an official capacity. Also, it is very important for proposition to emphasize that and frame this violent resistance, this opening of this transfer of power as like a last resort. So this means that this is one of the last before he takes power, this is one of the last opportunities that you as a society have to like prevent him to prevent this kind of democratic backsliding from taking place, because after he gets into power he's going to like make a lot of undemocratic changes, make institutional changes. He's going to consolidate his power to a great extent, which means that in the future it's going to be very hard to take him out of power if like society doesn't like him. And also it's important to emphasize what democracy is, in that democracy is not just about elections, because opposition is going to come and say that, look, when you act violently to a politician who has been elected in a legitimate way on the will of the people, you yourself are acting undemocratically. You have to understand that democracy is a complex concept. It's not just about like elections and just after elections that's it, there's nothing else that you have to continue, but rather democracy is about much more. It's about like protecting basic human rights, it's about protecting minority rights, things like that. So moving on to the first argument, I think there are three arguments you can bring out here as proposition. First is on this whole idea of it being the last resort, this violent resistance. Second, in terms of this immediate violence outweighing the costs of the long-term harm that can occur by electing this undemocratic politician. And third, in terms of like long-term preservation of democracy. So first, in terms of it being the last resort, I think there are three prongs here that you can speak on. First, in terms of how this democratic leader is going to act, because understand that what's going to happen once this leader is elected is that he's going to dismantle democratic institutions. He's going to act in a way where his power is consolidated to a large extent, right? So this means that he's going to do things like removing term limits. He's going to concentrate power a lot. He's going to elect judges who are loyal to him. He's going to elect parliamentarians who are loyal to him. So it's really just going to be a government of people who are very loyal to him. His power is going to be consolidated to such a large extent that there's going to be virtually no way to get him out of power in the future, right? If it's a scenario where he has like gotten rid of term limits or something, there's not going to be any more elections in the future, so there's no opportunity for you to take him out of power, even if he is a bad leader in the future, right? So what this means is that even though he was elected on the will of the people right now, if society's viewpoint of him changes in the future, there's no way to like make sure that the changes in politics are going according to the will of the people, because like he's gotten rid of things like elections, he's gotten rid of like things like all the courts are very loyal to him, so there's no means of legal recourse, things like that, right? So this resistance at the point of transfer is like your only solution to getting rid of him, because after he gets into power, there's no way to get him out of power again. The second prong under this is in terms of democratic backsliding as a whole, because understand that even if there is still things like elections taking place and whatnot, a competitor who even if you elect someone else in the future, that person who is elected in the future has to make a lot of institutional changes, has to make a lot of constitutional changes, right? He even if this competitor says that, like, oh look, I promise to make democratic changes in the future once I'm elected into power, understand that these sort of promises are rarely followed through on, and you see this in countries like Sri Lanka, right? Because see, it is in human nature to seek power. Politicians, especially those who go for such high positions as like presidents and prime ministers, they are attracted to such high positions not because they like want to do good for the country, but just because they like power, they want to exercise power, and as such it's going to be very unlikely for them to make a lot of changes to the constitutional structures, to things like that, that actively reduces their power as a president or prime minister, right? This means that this kind of like undemocratic things are going to be very solidified in the nation itself, and it's going to be very hard to undo in the future. The third prong is that even if the third point here is that even if these even if like a competing politician does want to make changes, does want to make the entire structure of the governance system more democratic, wants to reduce his power, it's still going to be very hard to do, right? Because you understand that this looks like things like unpacking the Supreme Court, making reappointments. These are all very difficult to do through legitimate means, through proper means, where you're not exercising power that shouldn't be given to you, right? Understand that they have to make changes in a very politically polarized landscape where you have a lot of spread of disinformation. The entire political landscape of this country is extremely fragmented, is extremely broken, right? Understand that you're also going to have to do things like tackling the cultures. Understand that in a lot of these like democratic institutions, you're going to have like cultures of bribery, cultures of corruption. All of these are very institutional, a very deep entrenched changes that you're going to have to undo, and it is very hard for you to undo in the near future after you elect this undemocratic politician who has made all these kinds of changes, right? The second argument here is on how immediate violence outweighs the costs of long-term abuse. Because understand that first under this, it is going to be a very undemocratic and polarized landscape with a very power-hungry leader, which means that you're going to have this leader is ideally going to is most likely going to have conduct a lot of like human rights abuses when people disagree with him. He's likely going to be a very populist leader, and he's likely going to have a lot high levels of state control, right? Understand that minorities in particular are very heavily going to be stigmatized in these sorts of situations, because see, undemocratic leaders usually come into power because on the basis of like demonizing a certain group, whether they are religious or whether they are racial or regional, as a way to unify their voter base, right? Because see, people perceive the threat of an undemocratic leader as less than or even sometimes necessary to combat the danger posed by this like certain group. You need a strong leader to control terrorist groups and to bypass checks and things like that, because society thinks that is more important, because they care about their safety more than anything else, right? This means at this point in time, you're going to have a lot of minority rights abuses and things like that, right? Because, and it is at this point that even though he has been elected, his actions are not necessarily going to be like justifiable or legitimate, right? And this brings me back to my point about, on what you should have said in your framing about how democracy is not just about elections, but about protecting basic human rights. It's about like maintaining equality. And at the point in which you have like violence being conducted against certain groups, where you have like state sanctioned violence and things like that, this violence from society as a form of resistance at the point of political transfer of power is very justified. It is morally justifiable, right? Because see, understand that you're essentially going to have two options, right? You either choose violence now and understand that this violence is going to be very controllable and finite. You have this specific goal, we're going to get this leader out of power, and that's about it, as opposed to like these decades of violence, state sanctioned violence and whatnot, which can erupt in like social violence and like protests and things like that at some point, and understand that this kind of violence is much harder to curb because you're going after this like vast, much harder to fulfill goal of like re-establishing democracy as a whole, and it's very hard to like kind of control this violence and limit this violence, right? This brings me to my third argument on like long-term preservation of democracy, because if you look at countries right now in like Asia, in Africa, you see a lot of democratic backsliding happening, and this is because people blame bad, corrupt leaders who are acting undemocratically as a sign that democracy as a whole has failed. Individuals refuse to take accountability for their actions, for their choices. They would rather blame the regime itself than see that, look, it's their own choices and decisions that have led to this like corrupt leader taking power. So see, the idea here is that democracy is bad and leads to corrupt, unfit leaders, not that, look, we as a society should elect better leaders in the future and ensure accountability by like increasing democratic checks. So so understand that if you have this kind of violent resistance to the transfer of power before this like unfit leader is placed in power, you're going to prevent this sort of culture from taking place. You're going to prevent this sort of ideology from taking place, and this is going to be much better in terms of preserving democracy in the long run. Right, so I think we can move on to opposition's arguments now. There are three arguments here. First, in terms of how this violent resistance is simply going to legitimize undemocratic measures in the future. Second, in terms of it being undemocratic action in and of itself. And third, in terms of even if this violence resistance does succeed, it's still going to lead to long-term violence in the future. First, in terms of legitimizing undemocratic means, understand that this violent resistance is taking place in a nation where this leader has been democratically elected. This means that that leader has the support of most people within the nation, right? See, understand that for a social movement, for this kind of violent movement to succeed, you need things like social support of most of the people in society. You need things like institutional support and whatnot, right? And at the point in which majority of society actively has shown that they do disagree with the goal of your violent resistance, it is very likely that this resistance is ultimately going to fail, right? At the point in which this does fail, what you essentially do is that by having this kind of violent resistance to this election result, you're essentially legitimizing this leader to a much greater extent, right? Because now this undemocratic leader can come and say that, look, I'm acting as a defender of democracy, I'm acting as a defender of this legitimate election result, as a defender of this nation against these very violent anti-democratic forces, right? As such, they are going to use this kind of violent show of resistance as a way of creating like fear in people's hearts and actively manipulating them into believing that, look, things like mass arrests, things like curfews, things like restricting freedom of speech and information and media are necessities that I as a leader need to do in order to ensure that you as a nation are safe, you as a society are safe, and it is ultimately for the greater good. And people are going to be okay with that because they care about their immediate safety more than anything else. This looks like these leaders actively being able to do things like consolidating power and appointing loyalists and whatnot at a much faster extent than they would have had this violent resistance not taken place, because look, they can claim that the people surrounding me are very untrustworthy, they're actively being violent towards me, and as such I do need to take these measures. And again, people are going to be okay with that, they're going to be able to understand that, and they're going to want to prioritize the security over anything else. Second argument here in terms of this being an undemocratic action in and of itself, because understand that this is taking place in a country that is already at risk of democratic backsliding. This means that in this country, you're not going to have a lot of democratic institutions in the first place, right? This means that this election result is one of the few sources of legitimate democratic authority left in this nation. What you do when you come and say that, look, this democratic legitimately held election doesn't work, it's not correct, it hasn't resulted in a good leader, what you're doing then is you're just further eroding democracy, right? You're telling the people that democracy doesn't work, it's not a good means of like ensuring that this country is successful. what you do then is you create this idea in society that democracy, first of all, is something that just doesn't work at all, and even these people who are fighting for democracy don't believe that its institutions are very effective. But second, you're showing them that, look, democracy is simply this kind of tool that is only protected when it serves the interests of certain groups, and it can be very easily and very easily challenged by the people, by certain groups, and it doesn't have this kind of authority that you want it to have. Secondly, understand that you're setting up this precedent where when someone loses an election result, they are able to resort to violence, right? Because you have already shown that, look, this election has been conducted legitimately, but I'm still going to resort to violence because I don't agree with the result that has come about, right? What you do then is you set up this idea that, look, anyone can come and challenge election results, anyone can manipulate people into going into violent resistance, and understand that this does happen. You see this in nations. You have seen this in instances like Jan 6th and whatnot with Trump, because see, when you have leaders who have very loyal supporter bases and whatnot, who are very willing to go to very extreme lengths to ensure that their leader is elected to power, it's very easy to manipulate them and tell them that, look, this election isn't legitimate, the leader who has been elected isn't legitimate, we have to resort to violent means in order to secure a better future for our country. Third argument then, on even if this violent resistance does succeed. Understand and see, this is side proposition's best case scenario, right? So understand that even if it does succeed, you're still not going to have a very good future for this nation, right? Why? First of all, understand that you're creating this immense power vacuum within the nation, right? And it's very hard to fill this power vacuum. First, you have already established that elections within this country are untrustworthy, that you don't trust the result that has come about of this very legitimately held election already, right? Second of all, understand that this nation is going to be very disordered. It might even have result in things like civil war, and that is a very worst case scenario. But even if that doesn't happen, you're still going to have a lot of like disorder and chaos within the country, which means it's going to be very hard to hold an ordered election within this nation, right? This means that you cannot rely on democratic means like elections to institute a new leader in place of this leader who you are just like kicked out of power, which means that you're going to have this kind of power vacuum which can be open to things like military takeovers or even full-fledged dictatorships, right? You can even leave it open for things like international involvement, where you're opening up an area for things like external nations like the US to install puppet leaders. You're opening up a wide array of, you're opening a lot of pathways for like very bad leaders to come into power when you go and like actively oppose this legitimate election result, right? Understand that it's much safer for you to simply go along with this election result and still and it's much better for the nation as a whole, right? Because understand that alternatives still do exist, right? Things like de-democratization, they do take a few years. De-democratization of institutions and whatnot, you're still going to have whilst this man is in power, you're still going to have means of recourse through things like courts, through things like institutions, through things like media. Even after the power, you're going to have a lot of ways of challenging the ideas and actions of this undemocratic leader, and it is much better for the country for you to utilize these measures as opposed to resorting to a violent election, to a violent resistance. So I hope this has been helpful for you all. Yeah.